With our next lecture entitled The Rise of Kingdoms, a major theme is going to be the centralization of power in the hands of kings and, in some cases, governing institutions like parliaments. And this is going to mark a very important development with respect to how things worked during the early Middle Ages. So you might remember, as we discussed previously, under feudalism, in theory, kings have tremendous authority over their vassals, the nobles who govern their fiefs on behalf of the king. In actual practice, they had a tremendous amount of autonomy. Right? The king does not have a professional army. In fact, he depends on the nobles if he wants to put together an army. And he has nothing resembling a proper bureaucracy or administration. Right? A large number of individuals who actually work for the king to carry out his decrees and so forth, right? To collect taxes, things of that nature. So yes, in theory, kings had authority over their vassals, but at the same time, it was very limited. And we should note that even in theory, there were limits on the king's authority, right? He did have to honor certain rights and privileges that the nobles had. And then on top of that, right, I mean, ultimately much depends on the individual character of the king, right? If it was a strong, very charismatic individual, he might do okay. But if you had a weak king, he could be in real trouble, right? You might have a situation where certain noble families who perhaps have a claim to the throne might attempt to overthrow him, right? They might form an alliance against him and so forth. And particularly if the king is not very savvy at playing one noble family off of another and so forth, he could be in real trouble. Now, having said that, kings did have certain advantages that gave them some leverage when dealing with the nobles. First of all, they are religiously sanctioned, right? So, this is a very powerful idea at the time, the divine right of rule. Kings are sanctioned by God. Going against the king is in effect to go against God's will. So it's not something a noble is going to do lightly. Certainly many of the king's subjects might view this very disfavorably. And if a king is fairly clever and capable, he will know how to utilize that principle to his advantage. The other thing is kings do have certain things they can do in order to enhance their authority. The two probably most important ones are war and marriage, right? So war, if he is able to put together his army and conquer land, that is something that will make him very popular. He can then use territory that he's acquired, as a way of rewarding followers by granting them land. So that becomes an incentive for them to follow king, again, particularly if he knows what he's doing and is very successful at war. The other very important institution that he can take advantage of is marriage. And throughout much of the history of Europe, even coming into the modern period, marriage among royalties is primarily about forming alliances, right? So, that can be a way to acquire additional territory, something that the Habsburg dynasty, what will become one of the most important dynasties in Europe, who will create a vast empire centered around Austria and including much of Southeast Europe, parts of Central Europe. Much of that territory was acquired through marriage. And also just as a way of forming alliances as a kind of protection against anyone attempting to overthrow the king. Right? So kings are not without power, and some of them are going to be able to use these different mechanisms in order to acquire more authority within their hands, right? So we're going to provide here a kind of overview of developments in Europe, but we're going to focus in particular on three different kingdoms. England and France, where we're going to see kings proving to be very successful at centralizing authority within their own hands. And then in the case of the Holy Roman Empire, this is going to be where, an attempt at consolidating authority within the hands of the emperor, whereby he might solidify this empire that Charlemagne initiated in the center of Europe, is going to fall a bit short, right? One of the reasons why today we don't have a large state in the center of Europe, roughly corresponding to Germany and Italy. So looking first at developments in England, during much of the early Middle Ages, was divided up into many small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, remembering Anglo-Saxon referring to the Angles and Saxons, these Germanic tribes that had started to settle in England, eventually becoming unified under Alfred the Great and his successors in the 9th and 10th centuries, right? So it's kind of a long, drawn-out story. We're not going to go into the details about that. But suffice it to say, by the 10th century, most of what today is England is a unified kingdom. And then a very important development is going to happen in the mid-11th century, when the king at that time, Edward the Confessor, is going to have his right to the throne challenged by a cousin of his, William of Normandy. And that is going to lead to an invasion of England by the Normans in what today is Normandy in France, right? So the Normans are actually a Viking people that at some point had created settlements, eventually some of them evolving into smallish kingdoms, and then, eventually interacting with other members of royalty so that some of them, are kind of intermarrying, and then eventually even having claims to other thrones. And that's pretty much what happened here, where William of Normandy is now claiming the English throne, and Edward the Confessor is going to resist. So at some point, very famously in 1066, William of Normandy is going to invade England with the purpose of seizing the throne. And the decisive battle, the Battle of Hastings, will be fought on October 14th, 1066, with William proving victorious. Right? So following the battle, William will advance on London, where he is crowned King of England on Christmas. And this might remind you of a similar development with Charlemagne, where he was christened the Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas. Right? Just kind of a way of indicating that this somehow reflects the will of God. The Battle of Hastings, this is one of those dates I actually expect you to remember. At least the year 1066. Battle of Hastings, that sees William of Normandy take the throne in England, and will mark a major change in the trajectory of developments in England. And here you see a very famous tapestry that is in France today, the Bayeux Tapestry, though I actually got to see it as it was part of a traveling expedition in Italy, where they were doing kind of a special presentation on the history of the Normans in Europe. The Normans would also create a kingdom in Sicily in the south of Italy, again, a Viking people. So it's a really beautiful tapestry, right? I mean, it's quite large. This is only a small part of it, commemorating the Battle of Hastings. So as noted, with William on the throne, we're going to see a major change in the trajectory of developments in England, corresponding to a greater centralization of authority in the hands of the king. And so, very often when you have an invasion of this magnitude, right, where they, a completely, in a sense, new monarchy being established, it provides an opportunity for reconfiguring how things operate at a very fundamental level. William is going to treat all of England as his own possession, immediately designating 1/5 of the land as royal domain, and then divvying up the remainder of it among the nobles and the church as fiefs, right? But now they owe their authority to him. And related to this, he's going to create a hierarchy of nobles, but really kind of laying the basis for a strong centralized monarchy, right? Retaining as much authority in his own hands. And I should note that he still has authority within Normandy of France, right? So he's the Norman King of England, but now also the Duke of Normandy in France, which kind of signifies that within Normandy he should, to some degree, acknowledge the authority of the French king. But this is actually going to end up becoming a contested territory. One very important development as well, William almost immediately is going to take a census of England, right, in terms of not just the population, but also who has authority over what land, who has some degree of ownership over which territories. And this census will come to constitute a very massive book known as the Doomsday Book. It sounds like something out of a James Bond film, but it really is just a census. But this becomes a basis for how to determine taxation. Right? Taxation means now revenue going into the royal coffers, meaning the king now has revenue to start building up a bureaucracy, maybe even down the road having a professional army. So by the way, if you're a king and you want to centralize authority in your own hands, it really does start with your ability to tax people, to tax your subjects directly, and in a way that doesn't leave you dependent on the nobles. By the way, if you're ever in the UK, if you have a chance, you might visit the Public Records Office, kind of the National Archives of Britain. just outside of London, where you can see the original Domesday Book on display, which was produced in 1086. So there are some things that William is going to maintain from the previous administrative system under the Anglo-Saxon administration, right? Which had been based on dividing up the territory into counties known as shires, each of which was run by a sheriff, though now the sheriffs will all be Normans. So that's kind of left in place. There were also some other institutions which now he's going to strengthen, right? You have royal officers responsible for leading the military, collecting royal tolls, and presiding over county courts, right? So these three positions are very important to the centralizing of authority in the hands of the king, right? So first of all, royal officers leading the military. Well, if you're the king, you want to have direct authority, direct control over the army. The collecting of royal tolls, right? So if people are moving around in your kingdom and have to pay a kind of tax to move over a border, that money now comes into the royal coffers. And then also, county courts, basically a king wants to have authority over matters of justice, right? Now, William is going to further develop the system of taxation and royal courts. Again, these are institutions that had existed prior to his taking the throne, but he's going to do a lot to strengthen them. Probably, again, the most important thing is that he is able to increase the revenue he is able to raise through taxation. So William laying the foundations for the kind of centralization of authority in the hands of the king, and this is a process. Is going to continue under his successors. I should note one other very important development connected with William and the Norman invasion of England, that they introduce the French language into English, right? So it's going to, in connection with that, evolve tremendously from what was known as Middle English, becoming something more familiar to us today, right? So the English we speak today, heavily influenced by the French language, courtesy of William of Normandy. In any event, though, coming back to the story of the centralization of authority in the hands of kings, another important individual in this regard is going to be Henry II. Who also, when he takes the throne, will initiate a new dynasty. So following a brief period of civil war, we're going to have the Plantagenets starting with Henry II, and he is going to further strengthen the monarchy through a number of important reforms. Probably the most important is the development of the exchequer, a permanent royal treasury, right? So, they're kind of formalizing the whole process of collecting taxes, determining where they go, and then later on determining how to spend that, right? So starting with, of course, the collecting of taxes by royal officials. So royal officials will receive the taxes collected by the sheriffs, and then they go into the exchequer, right? So you now have a formal treasury, a royal treasury to which the king has direct access. Henry II is also going to expand the jurisdiction of the royal courts with respect to the number and types of criminal cases tried in them, related to which we're also seeing the development of what will become known as common law, right? And that is, in fact, what you have today in the United Kingdom, or at least with respect to England, right? A body of common law where basically, as you bring more and more territories within the kingdom under the direct jurisdiction of the royal courts, you need to determine which laws are common to all these different territories, right? So, by the way, common law is just this huge body, like kind of a list of laws that they would keep adding on to, right? And again, the basic idea that these laws are common to all the different parts of the kingdom, and eventually becoming the basis for replacing local law codes, right, with one common law, as in common to the whole kingdom. So the kings are really beginning to acquire real power in England. And as you might imagine, many of the nobles are going to become concerned about this. And so this is going to lead to one very significant development during the reign of Henry's son, King John, where the nobles are going to threaten to rebel. And it almost comes to a battle at a place called Runnymede in 1215, but at the very last second, John capitulates to the nobles and assents to what comes to be known as the Magna Carta. I mean, Magna Carta actually just means Great Charter, and there in fact will be another Magna Carta well down the road, right? But very often if you hear someone refer to the Magna Carta, they're talking about this document that was signed by King John, which basically is about preserving the privileges and rights of nobles. It really is in effect a feudal document, but later on will be perceived as kind of a first step on the road to parliamentary democracy, inasmuch as it kind of really emphasizes the idea that a king's authority is limited rather than absolute, right? That to some degree the king is subject to the law, in this case as corresponds to the rights and privileges of nobles, and does not have unlimited authority, right? In other countries in Europe, we're going to see the development of absolute monarchy, wherein in effect the law is whatever the king decrees it. Right, so this really does mark kind of a point at which, how things evolve in England is diverging from much of Europe. Again, the basic idea that the king's authority is limited, and that there are certain rights enjoyed by, in this case, nobles, but later expanded to include all Englishmen, that the king cannot encroach upon. Well, we should note as well, we're starting to see other parts of the British Isles come under English authority. One very important development under Edward I, who reigns between 1272 and 1307. We're going to see the Principality of Wales come under English control. Scotland's going to take a little bit longer. Eventually that will be brought under English domination as well. But will maintain its integrity as a distinct kingdom. Wales, I refer to it as the Principality of Wales. That actually does kind of reflect the fact that it came under English control. So even today, right, if we talk about the United Kingdom, you have the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland. Those are the United Kingdom. Wales is designated a principality, and from a pretty early point after its subjugation by England, the head of Wales is considered to be the heir to the British throne, right? The English throne, later on the British throne. So even today, right, we refer to the heir of the British throne as the Prince of Wales. Currently, the Prince of Wales is Prince Charles. So there you go. We should note that also under Edward I, this is where the English Parliament is going to emerge as a very important representative body, to some degree reflective of, this idea that the authority of the king is limited, right? That you now have an institution that represents the will of, you want to say the people, but really to some degree we're still talking about nobles, maybe to some degree wealthy commoners, and this will be the English Parliament. And increasingly, kings are going to find that they have to govern in cooperation with this body in England, right? I should note, right, just one last point, from a pretty early point, Wales, now being under English control, is also subject to whatever laws are created by the English Parliament. Later on, when Scotland is, kind of more directly linked to England, it will still maintain, I said it will maintain its integrity as a separate kingdom, meaning, among other things, that the English Parliament will not have any legitimacy in Scotland. Whatever laws they come up with, whatever arrangement they have with the king by way of cooperating in governing, only applies to England. So what is this Parliament about? Right? Well, the Parliament initially corresponded to an informal council of advisors made up primarily of barons, i.e. nobles, and church lords, right? Like very important members of the clergy who would have provided advice to the king, which the king might choose to accept or reject. What we're going to see, and it's not going to become formalized until hundreds of years later, but over time, a kind of unspoken tradition will emerge. You could say a gentleman's agreement, whereby there is an expectation that the king will accept the advice of the Parliament, at least with respect to matters of taxation, right? And that is really going to start with Edward I, who in 1295 invites 2 knights from every county and 2 residents from each city and town to meet with his advisors in order to consent to new taxes. And this will constitute the first formal parliament, right? And what's really important here, right? I mean, the idea is that Edward I feels that he can legitimize his decision to impose new taxes by getting these representatives to consent to them, right? So, in principle, he doesn't need their consent, but it does make it somehow more palatable, more acceptable to the people who are going to be paying the taxes, right? So it doesn't have the force of law, but this will be pretty much how kings moving forward operate. Kind of the idea that if I'm going to impose new taxes or come up with new ways to spend the revenue I've collected, that like kind of radically different from what I've been doing until now, probably would be a good idea to get the consent of this parliamentary body. Now, the other thing I'd want to highlight here is he invited not just knights, which would have been nobles, but also individuals coming from cities and towns who are commoners, right? They would have been wealthy, probably very educated, influential commoners, but nonetheless, they are not nobles. And this is eventually going to result in there being two different bodies within the parliament. A House of Lords, right, where the representatives of knights would meet, also individuals representing the church. So the first two estates, which are the clergy and the nobles, and then the other institution or body would be the House of Commons, where these burgesses, very important people from the cities and towns, would basically congregate, right? And so today, if we think about the parliament, you still have a House of Lords and a House of Commons. House of Commons is the more important body. They're the ones who actually come up with legislation that then has to be approved by the House of Lords. But the powers of the House of Lords will increasingly diminish over time. So this is where it started. It started with Edward I. And in fact, at this point, we're going to leave England and move over to France and consider how things develop there, right? So the same basic development in terms of the centralization of authority in the hands of a king, but in this case, where it really is just the king, there isn't going to be any kind of representative body like a parliament with which the king will have to cooperate, right? So that represents kind of a major difference between developments in England and France. I should note that in many ways, developments in France correspond to developments in most parts of Europe. To one degree or another. In most parts of Europe, kings will end up governing for the most part without any kind of representative body, though not always. In some cases, there will be something similar to the parliament in England, though very rarely having as much authority or ability to kind of limit the authority of the king. Well, in any event, in France, we might begin our story with Philip II, who reigned between 1180 and 1223. And so he represents the Capetian dynasty, which by the end of the 10th century was ruling France, but had very little real power beyond about a 20-mile radius around Paris, right? An area of land often referred to as the Ile-de-France. Ile-de-France meaning kind of the island of France, basically indicating that this is the only territory where the king has direct authority. Everywhere else in his kingdom, he has to operate through the nobles, right? So what's going to happen here is at some point, Philip II, sometimes referred to as Philip II Augustus, finds himself at war with the Plantagenets of England over Normandy, right? So I mentioned that Normandy, which is in the north, currently in the north of France, just over the English Channel, across the English Channel from France, is going to be a contested territory. And so what's really important here is that Philip II is going to be able to use the fact that he is at war with England as a basis for convincing the nobles of the need to increase the income of the French monarchy, right? So he's basically going to quadruple the income of the French monarchy through taxation and then use this revenue to basically enhance his power. Right, so that kind of marks, again, the beginning of a development that's going to involve a number of monarchs. Another very important one in this development is going to be Louis IX, who reigns between 1226 1270. By the way, considered to be one of France's greatest kings, in large measure because he was a really good guy. A very religious man who, in fact, later is made a saint, i.e. canonized by the church. and is known primarily for his concern for the welfare of his people, right? That he would really try hard to bring justice to his people, to ensure their rights. But related to this, he felt it very necessary to keep tabs on what the nobles were doing. And so, among other things, would send out royal agents to check on the activities of people who supposedly represented his authority, including royal officials. He would also become a major player in the Crusades, right? He would play a role, in fact, in 2 of the Crusades, and we'll be looking at the Crusades later. There were quite a few of them. So, very important there is the fact that he took a great interest in the welfare of his people and became much more active in trying to directly manage what happened in his kingdom. Well, that finally brings us to Philip IV. So by the 14th century, we already have kind of the beginnings of a fairly effective bureaucracy in place. And by the way, we do have a parliament, a French parliament. But in the case of France, the parliament is actually going to diminish in power, whereas in England, the parliament is going to become stronger and stronger over time. So Philip IV, reigning between 1285 1314, very instrumental in helping to develop this effective bureaucracy. And again, bureaucracy referring specifically to the individuals who work in government on behalf of his authority. So what happens here is he actually does create this French parliamentary body known as the Estates General. In this case, it corresponds to a struggle he is having with the Pope, where he feels he needs more revenue. So he summons a meeting of representatives of the church and nobility in towns in 1302, very similar to what we saw happen in the case of England, and this will lead to the creation of something called the Estates General, so called because it represents the 3 estates of medieval society, which we're going to learn more about down the road, right? But the 3 estates basically corresponding to the first estate being the clergy, the second estate being the nobles, the third estate, the commoners. And so the Estates General will actually utilize that as a basis for strengthening the French monarchy by getting them to agree to increasing taxation, thus increasing the revenue going into the royal coffers. So that is kind of the main development there. Again, we're going to kind of pick up the story later. We're going to kind of finish here for now with developments in France, but the basic gist of it is that so he's using the Estates General to create more revenue for the king, which will strengthen him, allow him to expand his bureaucracy, to develop a professional army, or at least kind of the beginnings of that. And then further down the road, subsequent kings are going to work very hard to diminish the influence of the Estates General. So kind of the opposite story from what's going to happen in England. Well, moving now very briefly to developments in Spain. You might remember where we left things. Most of Spain was under Muslim control, became part of this very large Islamic empire, which eventually will fragment, but you will still see, at some point you see the emergence of a number of smaller Muslim kingdoms in most of Spain. They never take the northern part of Spain, right? So a number of small Christian kingdoms will remain in northern Spain, really become entrenched by the 11th century, and that will become a base by which there will be this successful attempt to, from their point of view, retake Spain in the name of Christendom, right? So this becomes what is known as the Reconquista, or reconquest of Spain. Again, this idea of reconquering Spain reflecting a very kind of Christian European perspective. But at some point, these kingdoms will launch an offensive against the Muslims to the south. And by the 12th century, the Christian, quote-unquote, reconquest is really going to pick up steam, particularly moving into the 13th century. Eventually, you end up with 3 dominant Christian states in most of Spain. At some point, the Muslim kingdoms are confined to the southeast corner of what today is Spain. And the 3 dominant Christian kingdoms will be Aragon, Castile, Portugal. Aragon and Castile will eventually unify to become the Kingdom of Spain. Portugal, of course, today a separate state. one interesting kind of development as they move along, kind of one way in which the Christian armies consolidate their control over conquered territory, the rulers pursue a policy known as repartimiento, whereby houses, land, and property that has been conquered are distributed to those who actually made the conquest. Right? The military commanders who were deemed most responsible for whichever victory had seen them conquer territory is given control over some of that land. That becomes a major incentive to kind of keep moving forward. And I think this map does a pretty good job kind of illustrating the progress of the Reconquista. So you see in the 9th century, in the northern part of Spain, you have Christian kingdoms. By the way, for instance, if you travel to Spain today as a tourist, in much of Spain, you can see a lot of evidence culturally, in terms of architecture, in terms of historical sites, a lot of evidence of the long period of Islamic rule in the country. When you go to the northern part of Spain, it really does feel like, somehow it had a very separate history from the rest of the country, right? So I've had the pleasure of visiting many parts of Spain. In the north, the first time I went to the north, I was like, wow, this feels like very different. Like a lot of things that we associate with Spanish culture, Spanish traditions, things like, for instance, flamenco music, many words that we find in the Spanish language, the structure of homes where you very often have kind of an open courtyard in the center. Much of that really does correspond to Islamic influence, reflects this kind of long, the centuries of Islamic rule that much of Spain experienced. In the north, you don't find a lot of this, right? It really does feel very different. In fact, the people in the north of Spain very often kind of having a Celtic point of origin, right? So this is evident, for instance, in some of the dialects spoken there. When I was in the north, for instance, there's kind of an indigenous music that uses the bagpipes, which most people associate with Scotland, things of that nature. So in any event, right, that was under Christian control, even going back to the 9th century. You can see coming into the 10th, the 11th, 12th centuries, beginning to conquer more and more of the Iberian Peninsula. And then finally, as of the 14th century, the only thing that remained under Muslim control is what you see in yellow there, roughly corresponding to the Kingdom of Granada, which is why, for instance, if you visit Spain today and you go to Granada, probably the most important tourist site is the former palace, Islamic palace fortress of the Alhambra, right? Alhambra in Arabic, meaning kind of red because it has kind of a reddish tint, the stone, but very beautiful and very clearly influenced by its Islamic origins in terms of the architecture, the structures, and so forth. So going off a bit on a tangent there, though hopefully you found some of that information interesting. At this point, I want to turn to the center of Europe, where the attempt to centralize authority in the hands of the king, or in this case really the Holy Roman Emperor, will ultimately fail. So you might remember the Holy Roman Empire, initiated by Charlemagne, eventually comes to include most of what today is Germany and the northern part of the modern state of Italy. So what you have there is, right, for the most part, Holy Roman Emperors are German kings who are working very hard to assert their authority over their territory, and it's pretty vast, the territory that makes up the Holy Roman Empire. But here the nobles are going to be able to maintain a certain degree of autonomy to the point where it's almost as if they're kings themselves over these much smaller territories that make up the Holy Roman Empire. And eventually, in fact, we will refer to them as kings or princes. And you have, at some point, well over 100 of them, right? Like these smaller kingdoms or principalities. Some of them are bishoprics, where you have a bishop in control, city-states, and so forth. And so you have a Holy Roman Emperor, mostly Germans, who are trying very hard to assert their authority. A tradition had emerged whereby these individuals would be elected by the nobles, but they're intentionally electing individuals who are fairly weak with the idea of strengthening their own regional power. So there will be a few German kings that will try very hard to make their authority real, starting with what they do have, right? They try to compensate for their weakness by their ability to control the church, particularly their right to appoint bishops and abbots. And probably more importantly, in theory, they have a certain degree of authority over many territories in Italy. So some of them will try to use that as a basis for increasing revenue, and then hopefully using that revenue to assert their authority in the German parts of their kingdom. Now, during this period, Italy has no central authority. It's made up of a number of different states, some of which are part of the Holy Roman Empire. You have also the Papal States under the authority of the Pope. Within those territories, he has not just religious authority, but also political authority. The south dominated by Lombard dukes, not part of the Holy Roman Empire. And then further south, initially you have territories under either Muslim or Byzantine control. But, very often these territories in conflict with one another, so territory going back and forth. One development in the south of Italy worth highlighting. We had talked about the Normans who became established in Normandy, eventually took control of England. The Normans, a Viking people, will also establish themselves in southern Italy under a fellow named Robert Guiscard. In 1091, his brother Roger will then go on to subdue Muslim Sicily. And then he and his son Roger II, who is crowned king of Sicily, will create this really very interesting kingdom that is a fusion of Latin, Greek, and Arab/Islamic influences, right? So it ends up being a very temporary kind of situation, but it is kind of interesting that you have this Norman kingdom centered in Sicily, including much of southern Italy, that is a kind of melting pot of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim culture. And they even kind of formally acknowledge this, right? So, for instance, state documents would have been issued in Latin, Greek, and Arabic. And so a tremendous amount of tolerance of these different cultures, different religions, but it proves to be very short-lived. So it's always kind of an interesting question. If it had been able to more firmly entrench itself, how might it have evolved, right? It might have actually, kind of an early example of an attempt at a multicultural society. But that is, again, a bit of a diversion. Coming back to the Holy Roman Emperors desiring to assert their authority over their empire, probably the first really serious attempt will be under Frederick I Barbarossa, who reigned from 1152 until 1190. So he is the Holy Roman Emperor. Right, in theory, has authority over all of the Holy Roman Empire, powerful lord from the Swabian house of Hohenstaufen. This is one of the important noble families in the German lands. And so he's a good example of, someone who's going to try and do this by starting with Italy, right? Where, again, thinking if he can, and the Italian state's, by the way, fairly wealthy. You still have some cities there who are very active in Mediterranean trade, one of the only parts of Europe during the Middle Ages that is still active in that way. So, some of them becoming wealthy. So it's like if I can derive sufficient revenue from Italy, I can use that to strengthen my control of the Germanic part of the empire. The problem there is eventually this is going to bring him into conflict, not just with the Pope, who, in theory should support the Holy Roman Emperor, right, who is trying to unite Christendom into one empire, but really feels more fearful of him becoming too powerful in Italy, right, particularly with respect to the Papal States. He sees it as a threat to his own authority. The cities in northern Italy also want to protect their autonomy. To some degree, their autonomy is what has allowed them to become wealthy. So, they see the idea of coming under more direct control of the Holy Roman Emperor as a threat to that. And so they're going to resist. And in the end, the Pope and the northern Italian cities, it will come to a military conflict. They're going to unite, form an alliance, and they are able to defeat the forces of Emperor Frederick at a place called Legnano in 1176 in the northern part of Italy. Frederick doesn't give up at that point. He tries to negotiate an arrangement with the northern Italian cities. It's like, okay, I hear you. How about you maintain your autonomy in exchange for making some annual payments to the emperor, right? So it won't be me directly taxing you or having that kind of authority, but if you make these payments, I'll leave you alone. And actually, that does seem to be working up to a point. And then he tries to further strengthen his control over Italy by bringing southern Italy under his control through marriage. He marries his son to the Norman kingdom's heiress, Henry VI. In some ways, that kind of marks the end of this multicultural Norman kingdom we talked about. And who knows, it might have worked, but unfortunately for him, his son dies prematurely. After which all of the whole arrangement basically collapses, and he's never able to really fulfill his ambition to assert some real authority over the Holy Roman Empire. So the next attempt will be by his grandson, Henry VI's son, Frederick II, who again is going to focus on Italy. He gives the German nobles, or we might say princes, full control over their territories while he's focusing on bringing northern Italy under his control. But again, he's going to fail, right? It's pretty much kind of a repeat of what happened before. The northern Italian cities are very protective of their autonomy, as is the Pope. And that pretty much will be the last time a Holy Roman Emperor makes a serious attempt at bringing the Holy Roman Empire under his control. From that point forward, particularly in the Germanic lands, the German princes, right, these nobles, we call them German princes because at some point they're really becoming more kings, where they have not just some degree of practical autonomy, but even on a theoretical level, kind of more direct authority within their territories. The Holy Roman Empire will continue for many centuries, to be sure, and then you will have kind of an attempt by a few Holy Roman emperors to assert more authority with respect to religious matters during the Protestant Reformation, but nothing quite on the to the extent that we saw under Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II. And eventually the Holy Roman Emperor's title will become more, as far as having any kind of authority, really more of a figurehead, kind of a nominal authority over the Germanic kingdoms. And then the Holy Roman Empire will come to an end under Napoleon. But at that point, it was a bit of a joke. I mean, you kind of got rid of it because it didn't mean anything by that point. In any event, by way of rounding up developments in other parts of Europe, in Scandinavia, centralization of authority in the hands of kings working out pretty well. By the 11th century, 3 Scandinavian kingdoms have emerged: Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, and probably sound very familiar to you. These all exist today as independent states. A major factor, basically, they're going to be in conflict with one another quite a bit, particularly after they all convert to Christianity. And usually the conflicts involve, when a king dies, you have rival claimants to the throne. This kind of touches on the fact that increasingly we're finding a lot of intermarriage taking place between various royal families, again, very often in an attempt to form alliances. But it really is going to get out of hand by some point, where pretty much you ultimately end up, if you're a member of royalty, you're marrying someone else of royalty, you're probably marrying someone who's a second or third cousin at minimum, and that creates other kinds of issues down the road, which we won't go into here. Looking at developments in East Europe, by the 11th century, we see the emergence of a fairly sizable Polish kingdom, much bigger than the modern state of Poland. This is part of the problem of being in the middle of Europe, where it's really hard to establish firm boundaries. There are no natural boundaries like rivers or mountains in many cases that can make a very clear delineation between this kingdom and another. So very often coming into conflict with neighboring Germans to the west or Slavs to the east, and very often at war. To the south, we have a kingdom becoming established in Hungary, made up primarily of Magyars. We talked about them as a people newly arrived in Europe at some point. And we might finish part 1 of this lecture with a consideration of a rather unique Germanic state that emerges in the kind of northeast part of what today roughly corresponds to Germany and parts of Poland, East Prussia. Right, so they're going to become basically intrinsically connected with a military religious order known as the Teutonic Knights, who had become very active in connection with the Crusades, had gone over there to quote-unquote protect the Christian Holy Lands against the Muslim infidels. After the Crusaders had established a number of Crusader states. We're going to look at that in part 2. But then at some point, they're going to become very active on the kind of Christian/pagan frontier of Northeast Europe, where they basically go to war with pagan Slavs and eventually are rewarded with East Prussia in 1226. It's basically given to them, right? Kind of the idea that it's on the frontier of European Christendom. And so by the end of the 13th century, a new state has emerged, or kingdom, Prussia, that is essentially German and Christian, very heavily associated with the Teutonic Knights, so has a kind of militaristic character to it. And that might be a factor in why further down the road, Prussia is going to be seen as a very militaristic state. And then even Germany is often perceived that way, particularly when we get to the early 20th century in connection with the First and Second World Wars. Some would argue that, when we think of Germans as being somehow militaristic, which is a stereotype, highly exaggerated. I've had the pleasure of living in Germany for a while. Germans are just, super cool, great people and all that. But a lot of that stereotype really kind of, people are thinking more of Prussia, which today is one state within Germany, right? So anyway, that really is more a story for Western Civilization Part 2. We'll end the first part of our lecture here, and do make sure to check out the second part.